waking up right before class if you didn't have one before us. But a couple of things I want to talk about before I continue talking about the civil rights movement and Black Power. I know we just finished one big paper, but there are two papers left in this class, right? And for the next one, you actually have a choice. I'm going to give you a choice. And depending on what you end up going with, you might want to start at least thinking about it now. So don't freak out. I still haven't even graded the Belly of the Beast papers. So we have time before you have to work on the next one. But I want you all to be looking ahead. So if we go to the course website, let's go all the way to week 10. Like this week, you just have the a discussion board post, but let me make sure. I'm like, because on Monday when I realized that it was all out of order, or that had gone out of order. Yep. So next week is also just a discussion board post. Week 12 is just a discussion board post, but week 13. So this is right before the Thanksgiving break is when your next paper is. And I have the prompt up. What it is a 3 to 4 page paper or a video where you're going to engage with either a book or a movie that deals with the Asian American experience, right? We're trying to make sure we get as much of a wide range of ethnic and racial diversity in the topics we cover. And so this one is specifically to focus on the Asian American experience and to give you a choice there of, one, you're either going to write a paper. If you hate writing papers or you think you're no good at them, then maybe a video presentation is the better option for you there. Right? And what you have to do either in your paper or in your video is to answer these questions here, right? So one, what are the historical moments that are discussed in the book? What history is in there? Or what can be connected to the history? Sometimes it's not super obvious, but there is usually something you can connect to history, either the history of immigration or anything like that, right? Also, what stood out to you about the book, right? Or the movie? I do want you to talk general about, okay, what's the point of the book or the movie? How it tells the story it tells, right? Like, is it really about one family? Does it make it wider about, is it about the Korean American experience? What story we get in the book or movie? And then, did you learn anything? Is there anything new you learned? And who should be reading or watching the movie you're going to choose, right? So again, so you get a choice, either write a paper or create a 10-minute video. And in terms of the video, by the way, you don't have to be high tech with it. What some people have done in the past is they literally get their phones, put it on a tripod or sometimes not even on a tripod, on a bunch of books, hold it up somewhere and film themselves talking. Filming yourself talking would be good enough. Yeah, Jackie?
Can we make like a PowerPoint, like just to like organize what, like let's say it's a movie or it's a book, so you can like organize it on my own, like a Zoom.
Yes, and that's the other option I was going to say. So you don't have to be in the in the video at all. You can literally log on to the Zoom that you have access to for free through Cal State LA and just film and record your screen and going through a PowerPoint. Yeah. Angelica, that you are anticipating my next step. Can we ask you for a recommendation? Yes, I'm actually here. I've linked a Google Doc that I've started working on. So this is not everything that's going to be on here. I just started working on the list of recommendations, but here's a few memoirs that some of which I've read, others I have not read, but I have heard really good things about it. So I Love Yous Are for White People by Lac Sew. He lives in Southern California, and his family left Vietnam, escaped to China, and then to the US. So he has actually a really interesting story, and then about what the whole process was for his family and growing up in LA as a Vietnamese refugee. Crying in H Mart is a book that just came out this year. It has recently come out. So I haven't read it yet. I bought it because I want to read it. But I believe this one's about a Korean American. Hold on a second. I don't want to lie to you about it, but it is a memoir. It is it not about Korea? Yes, it's about a Korean American. The author is Korean American, and it's about her experience growing up as an Asian American in the United States. It from what I've heard, it looks really good. So I'm actually going to be reading that one soon. Know My Name by Chanel Miller is one you could do. Is not, Chanel Miller was sexually assaulted by Brock Turner. So most of you have probably heard the story if you have kept up with those news. Brock Turner was the athlete. He was like a swimmer who was, he was stopped by two study abroad students as he was assaulting Chanel by a trash can after a party. And it got a lot of news because during his trial, his dad came out and said things like, my son's going to suffer consequences for 15 minutes of action. And he got very little jail time. And anyways, it's a whole story. You can look it up. But her name was left out of the press. She was anonymous throughout the whole trial. And then recently wrote a book sharing her experience. And she talks about being Asian American and how that affected her going through this experience, especially of the trial, and how people were discussing her and her story publicly without knowing her. So it's a harder book to read because it's about sexual assault, and she goes into detail about, all of her experience through that. But that's an option to read if you're interested. Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong. It's, I think this is supposed to be a little bit, it's like, I haven't read it, so I can't tell you as much about it, but it's also a memoir about being Asian American. And I think it's supposed to have a little bit of a humorous take on it. So you can look it up. I'm going to provide links where you can read more about each of these books and decide if you want to read one of these books. Right. And I'll have a few more in there. I don't need you to buy the book, right? Most of these books, I'm trying to pick things that are going to be easy to find out there. You can check them out through your library. Most of these we don't have at Cal State LA, but they should be available through a public library. Right. So don't pick something you don't have access to. Look at the options and then find something that's going to be available. For movies, recently there's been a few very profitable Asian American movies with Asian Americans, but they're not all about the Asian American experience, right? So you wouldn't be able to do something like Crazy Rich Asians, for example, because Crazy Rich Asians is not about being Asian American. I loved that movie, but it's just not about being Asian American. So instead, I have a few recommendations here. Tiger Tail is on Netflix. So if you have access to Netflix. Gook, that's another one that's available through like IMDb TV. So it is available free. Children of Invention is also on IMDb TV. And that one is about an Asian American family and this dad who's trying to he's got all these get rich schemes and about how the kids deal with it. The Farewell, I think most of these I haven't seen, so I'm kind of just going off of descriptions online, right? But also about kind of navigating being in between two cultures. I put Minari in here, even though Minari I haven't found to be available for free anywhere. If you're interested in renting it or paying for it or finding it online illegally, you can do a different movie that as long as you can find it online, then you can do that. I'm going to be adding a few more on here that I'm going to look on Hulu and HBO Max and the ones that the streaming services that I know that some of you have access to. So you can also, if you already know one that comes to mind, you you would just have to run it by me. Yes, so Elizabeth, it is actually on Canvas. I will email this to you all, but it is under the prompt. It's Asian American book / film report. It's in the prompt. It says ideas for a memoir or film. But I can also share it on the chat right now. Share. I can put it in the chat for everybody. Yeah, but I'll make sure and email this to everybody, because the reason I'm talking about it now, even though it's not going to be due for a few weeks, is so that you have time to look up the books, look up the films, and decide which one you're going to do. Right, that's the main goal right now. Is you just need to be thinking about which one you might want to do. If another one comes to mind, you can just email me or tell me at the end of class, and I'm happy to just tell you, approve it, say yes, you can do that. As well, because I don't have, I don't know of every book and film that would fit the category. It just has to be Asian American, about the Asian American experience. So it should not be like, you can't do, a K-drama or something like that, because then that's more about it's set in Asia and dealing with more of Asian issues rather than Asian American issues. The other thing is to remember to look at the term Asian American broadly. I'm going to make sure that I have South Asian examples here. So for example, about any Indian American experience, that counts as Asian American. So South Asian, anything that fits under the South Asian category is still Asian American, for example. So it doesn't have to be China, Japan, Korea, any of the East Asians. Squid Game does not count. Even though I just finished watching Squid Game a couple of weeks ago, it doesn't count because it's in Korea and not in the US, right? It's not about being Korean American. It's particularly about Korea. Ooh, Jackie, White Tiger. I don't think I know that one. What is that? Is that a movie? I'm guessing it's a movie. 2021 film. Let's see, I can show you, like, this is going to be my, when you guys send me something and I don't know about it, this is how I'm going to look it up. Written by Ramin Brahmi. About Delvi, premiered in Las Vegas. I'm like, where's the plot? A request a meeting is to return to New York. Yes, it looks like a lot of it is set in India, but there's enough of it set in the US that it would work. So yeah, The White Tiger would count, and it looks like it's based on a book, so you could do the book or the movie. Other questions?
Sorry, I have a question,
Yeah.
Professor. Can we use more than one film or one memoir for the presentation, or do we just only use one?
I only need you to do one. If you want to read 2 books or watch 2 movies, I suppose you can. I'm not going to stop you for doing more work. But if there's 2, like if there's 2 movies right off the top of your head that you're like, that you want to talk about, you could do 2.
And it has to be 10 minutes, right?
The video has to be 10 minutes, yes.
Okay.
So there needs to be 10 minutes worth of information. If you go over a little bit, that's fine. If you're under 10 minutes, probably not fine. It needs to be at least 10 minutes. Do you have to cite it? No. So this is more of like a book report type of a thing. So you don't have to cite it. You just have to tell me what book. Somewhere in your paper or in your video, right? You have to tell me the title of the book or the movie and how to find it. So this is meant to be a kind of more laid back, less academic. You're still doing the work of analyzing it, right? But it's less academic in nature. Joseph, I am gonna look that up and I'll get back to you. I'm like, so if you want to stay at the end of class, Joseph, and I can look up what Kon-Tiki is and what and I can tell you if it'll work or not. Any other questions? No, okay, then you can still ask them as things pop up or you find things yourself. You can always email me or bring up whatever you're finding online. But I want to keep talking about the Black Power movement because the Black Power movement plays a big role, and it does begin with Black Power, with the Black Power movement, and then you're going to see kind of different versions of it in like Brown Power or Yellow Power, like people using that same terminology to express a much more radical reaction to racism in the United States, right? It's a response to racism in the US that is seen as more radical, right? Because in comparison to Martin Luther King Jr., for example, who is focused on nonviolent strategies, nonviolent strategies still require violence, but they are seen as typically better, less confrontational. I don't think that kind of look in contrast of like the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement is really fair, because the sit-ins, the freedom rights, they were still very confrontational and it required violence. But the Black Power movement becomes kind of like the boogeyman in the media, the thing that the people focus on as a scary element of fighting racism. And it really begins later in the 60s, in the second half of the 60s, especially when Stokely Carmichael becomes the head of SNCC, right, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, replacing John Lewis. By the way, John Lewis wrote several books. He was a civil rights leader who passed away a couple of years ago. So you could do any of John Lewis's books or graphic novels. There's also a couple of graphic novels about the Japanese internment camps that you could use as well for your project. But so in the late, halfway through the 60s, there's this shift of focusing on a much more seemingly radical element of civil rights. And Carmichael is the one who turns SNCC into a Black Power organization and really makes the Black Power movement a national movement, because these ideas really resonated with people all over the country, especially in urban cities. Right? In urban cities where the problem was not segregation, there was no segregation law in the books, but there was still segregation, there was still racism, right? There's still racism in Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, and all of these cities. And so the strategy had to be different. That was really the approach of the Black Power movement, is of saying, sit-ins, freedom rights don't work here because we don't have those explicit laws. Instead, the racism here is legal in different ways. And so you have to fight it then in different ways, right? And SNCC kind of maintains some of it, that's radical nature, even after Carmichael. In 67, Hubert Rapp Brown replaces Carmichael within SNCC. And he expresses, right, continues to express this Black power sentiment of, we're not going to passively sit back and let just people be racist towards us. Right? In a press conference, he said, I say you better get a gun. Violence is necessary. It is as American as cherry pie. And the idea was, all right, if this white racist person is going to be in my face with their racism, then I have a right to defend myself. And this often, right, gets really, well, you can see how the media handled it, right? How do you think this was all portrayed, this Black power rhetoric, how it was presented in on television by the news media?
Maybe rebellious.
Yeah, this was presented as, look at what these scary people are talking about. Right? They're not just talking about desegregation, they're talking about violence. They want to be violent against white people. And so it is a very scary image for a lot of, especially white Americans, when they're hearing people within the Black power express these ideas. And so they really become then kind of the boogeyman alternative to Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. Especially you see that in the person of Malcolm X. Right? What do you know about Malcolm X? I know you all have heard of him. We tend to not study Malcolm X as much as we study Martin Luther King Jr., right? Most of us know the story of Martin Luther King Jr., even if we don't remember all the details off the top of our head. We celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s Day every year. We get the day off. So at the minimum, you know him because of that. We tend to know a lot less about Malcolm X. And he actually has a very similar story. Aha, it's the violent issue. Yes, and I'll come to that. Catherine put in the Cassius Clay and Mike Tyson talked about him a lot. Yes, and I'll talk about that connection hopefully in a second. Like a lot of you have heard about him, so that makes me a little bit happier. His father, Malcolm X's father, was actually a Baptist minister, just like Martin Luther King Jr. And his family house was burned down by the KKK. His father was murdered 2 years after the house was burned down, and his mother was put in a mental institution. So while there are some parallels to Martin Luther King Jr.'s childhood, he also has a very different background in childhood. And his experience with the KKK and with the American government is different, right? He experiences social workers coming into his house on a regular basis, trying to catch his mother being a bad mother, and then to put the children in foster care. And the way that Malcolm X talked about that experience was as a very violent experience. People always coming into his house, always trying to break his family apart after his dad died. He does end up getting into a lot of legal trouble when he's young. He ends up being imprisoned for burglary in 1946. And it's when he's in jail that he converts to Islam, in particular to the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam is a very American take on Islam. A lot of Muslims don't consider the Nation of Islam like real Islam, because it tends to be a very American in nature. But at the time, the head of the Nation of Islam was Elijah Muhammad, who's also the founder of the Nation of Islam. And Elijah Muhammad's goal was Black self-determination. Right? So he would have agreed, for example, that segregation was necessary, that Black people should not be living with right next door to white people. Said, no, we are actually different and we should have our own communities and we should be able to support ourselves. We should have Black businesses, Black everything, and separate from those of whites. And that's that racial element is something that you don't see in broader Islam, for example. So it's very specific to the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X becomes very involved and becomes the most prominent public figure of the Nation of Islam, right? That leads to a lot of internal conflict within the Nation of Islam because Malcolm X was the one getting all the attention, all the cameras, and a lot of it was just, he was a great public speaker. When you would hear Malcolm X talk, everybody stopped and listened. Even people who were not interested in the Nation of Islam would attend his speeches because they were very political and very fiery, very dramatic, and just, he made you stop and pay attention to him. What's interesting about Malcolm X, though, is that because of that internal conflict within the Nation of Islam, he ends up leaving the Nation of Islam. He breaks away from them, right? Once he leaves the Nation of Islam, he makes a very famous pilgrimage to Mecca. He goes to Mecca and encounters different versions of Islam as he's doing his pilgrimage, right? And it really transforms him in very deep ways. And he gets a chance to talk and write a little bit about that transformation. But a very similar thing then to what the transformation that Martin Luther King Jr. went to, like both men begin with very particular ideologies. And then as they encounter the wider world, they shift in what they are talking about and what they think is the solution to racism in America. Malcolm X initially talked about leaving the United States and about how Black people needed to leave and go back to Africa, right? Then kind of after his pilgrimage to Mecca, his thoughts do change on that. But he is assassinated in 1965. And so we don't get to see really the full transformation of either one of these men, right? He's very famous though for the phrase, by any means necessary, right? Which indicates to a lot of people, it speaks about violence to many people. In reality, when you read his speeches and his writing, what Malcolm X is talking about was about self-defense. He wasn't advocating for people to go out and just like use violence against white people. That was not the goal. What he was talking about was describing the violence that was typically done, especially to Black urban communities, right? Black communities in cities and how they experience violent racism at the hands of the government, especially, right? And so the focus really was a lot on self-determination and self-defense. However, to an American audience, when they're hearing him talk about self-defense, right, it sounds like he's actually advocating for violence, right? And you can take those clips of him saying these things and it scared a lot of people. So it will come to no surprise, he is very heavily monitored by the American government. I mean, same with Martin Luther King, neither one of them. We forget how unpopular Martin Luther King Jr. was during his lifetime, and the CIA had extensive files on both of them. They had infiltrated both of their entourages and considered them some of the most dangerous men in the United States. Right? Do I have time? I might have time to play a little bit of this clip, and it's Malcolm X. Excuse me, Malcolm is talking about giving this speech of by any means necessary. I will lower the volume so that it doesn't blow all of our ears out.
Assalamu alaikum. Mr. Moderator, our distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, our friends and our enemies. Everybody is here. As many of you know, last March, when it was announced that I was no longer in the Black Muslim movement, it was pointed out that it was my intention to work among the 22 million non-Muslim Afro-Americans and to try and form some type of organization or create a situation where the young people, our young people, the students and others, could study the problems of our people for a period of time and then come up with a new analysis and give us some new ideas and some new suggestions as to how to approach a problem that too many other people had been playing around with for too long. And that we would have some kind of meeting and determine at a later date whether to form a black nationalist party or a black nationalist army. There have been many of our people across the country from all walks of life who have taken it upon themselves to try and pool their ideas and to come up with some kind of solution to the problem that confronts all of our people. And tonight we are here to try and get an understanding of what it is they've come up with. Also, recently, when I was blessed to make a trip or a pilgrimage, a religious pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, where I met many people from all over the world, plus spent many weeks in Africa, trying to broaden my own scope and get more of an open mind to look at the problem as it actually is.
Let's skip ahead a little bit.
And in a short time, they have gained more independence, more recognition, more respect as human beings than you and I have.
Hold on, I went too far.
Our people were colonized. They were suffering all forms of colonization, oppression, exploitation, degradation, humiliation, discrimination, and every other kind of Asian. And in a short time, they have gained more independence, more recognition, more respect as human beings than you and I have. And you and I live in a country which is supposed to be the citadel of education, freedom, justice, democracy, and all of those other pretty sounding words. So it was our intention to try and find out what was our African brothers doing to get results so that you and I could study what they had done and perhaps gain from that study or benefit from their experiences. And my traveling over there was designed to help to find out how. One of the first things that the independent African nations did was to form an organization called the Organization of African Unity. The purpose of our Organization of Afro-American Unity, which has the same aim and objective, to fight whoever gets in our way. To bring about the complete independence of people of African descent here in the Western Hemisphere and first here in the United States, and bring about the freedom of these people by any means necessary. That's our motto. The purpose of our organization is to start right here in Harlem, which has the largest concentration of people of African descent that exists anywhere on this earth. There are more Africans here in Harlem than exist in any city on the African continent, because that's what you and I are, Africans. The Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human
I'm going to stop it because when you first listen to Malcolm X and, you know, without having read about him much deeply, you get a sense of like, wait, this is the guy everyone was afraid of at first. Like, he's actually really intellectual. He has a very intellectual approach to racism. right? And but then he will throw in phrases like "by any means necessary," and that was like the clip that plays everywhere, right? And freaks out, yeah. And they're like, and that, but that's what's afraid of. That's what makes him scary to a lot of people. Is all right, what he's talking about are things about actually ending racism and how to fight racism, and of saying like, hey, if you're going to approach us with violence, we're going to respond in kind, right? We're going to respond the same way, defending ourselves. You notice also in a lot of his speech, especially after his pilgrimage to Mecca, he does a lot explaining his religion. In the United States, like the Nation of Islam was something really odd and hard to understand for a lot of people. And then also understanding where he fit in after his pilgrimage, because he's left the Nation of Islam and people are asking, well, what are you now, right? And he was very clear as he was a Muslim, right? He was Muslim. But his primary goal was fighting racism, right? What else? So those of you that have read him, have got a chance to read The Ballad of the Bullet. What else stood out to you about what he's saying in here? I think a lot of what he writes about and what he talked about in his speeches still resonates with people today. Even now with the social segregation, I'm reading in the chat, social segregation or political alignment, some people get scared of certain people who are too woke for woke. Back then, cancel culture was the bullet. Yeah, this felt, when we're talking about ending racism, right? People in the 60s, but even today, it feels like radical change. It does really mean changing a lot of key aspects of a society, right, to end racism. It's so embedded in so many different elements. He was very good at really talking about how racism affected every aspect of the experience of Black people in the United States. And not just Black people. He often, his message included people of other races and ethnicities, but it was very clear about how it affected people at every step of the way. He also had a very sharp understanding of history and of American history, right? So when I was in college, I took a class on the religious ethics of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And one of the things I liked was the way the professor described how if the US were on trial, right? If it were put on trial for racism, Malcolm X would have been like the key witness of the prosecution, because he understood exactly where all the problems were, especially for people in the cities. And that Martin Luther King Jr. in a lot of ways was, especially before his transformation, would have been a witness for the defense, because he believed that the US was redeemable, that you could change things, that you can end segregation and that people could live together in harmony. Whereas for Malcolm X, that he was like, no, we've had hundreds of years of this, and white people are not going to change. I do not want to change. So what do we do as Black people, is what he's saying, to not just survive this, but to just get away from this racism? And his answer was, we got to do things on our own. We cannot count on white people to save us, right? Yes, Rena, ending racism. Yeah, and it always sounds really radical. And I'm like, there is a really radical element here. But when you sit down and think about what it takes to end racism, maybe he's got a point. Maybe people have a point about what it actually takes to end things, to really radically change things. And it can sound really really scary to people who, a lot of times change is scary. We want the status quo. We want things to stay as they were. The other thing that really resonates about Malcolm X today is the way he talked about the political parties. he did not like either political party, the Republicans or the Democrats. In fact, he said he would rather deal with a white Southern racist person than a white liberal person. He said the white racist from the South will at least tell you to your face he doesn't like you. The white liberal from the North is going to pretend he likes you and then stab you in the back. As he said, that's what Democrats do. They talk nice while they're campaigning. They talk about ending things, but then they won't do anything. They haven't done anything. You would point to all the instances of the Democratic Party doing nothing to change racism in America. And he said, you can't vote for it for either party. Instead, what you have to do is focus on community building and on the Black community. The other group that gets also a lot of attention when you think of Black Power, you usually think about Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party. Right? The Black Panther Party was actually a very small organization, very small organization. It comes about in the 60s. And they are also, they're focused on that idea of, okay, we can't wait for white people to end racism. We have to do the work within our communities, right? They are calling for radical change, but the radical change was based on community building. It was based on like providing lunches to students, providing after school programs. It was all about what within the community we can do for ourselves without waiting for the government, without waiting for white people to do. And yet they become the emblem of like the bad guys, like Black people at like their worst is what they become a symbol of. Because usually when you think of Black Panthers and when people would talk about the Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s, and even today, the image that gets brought up is usually of a bunch of Black men with guns in their arms. What people forget though is that every time that they are carrying guns, it's legal wherever they're at, carrying weapons. They had permits for them, it was all legal. And this nasty outfits, Joseph, I mean, some of those outfits from the 60s and 70s are pretty great, yeah. The other thing that gets forgotten about the Black Panthers is that they did a lot of community organizing, not just within the Black community, but bringing in Latino groups and Asian American groups. Because in cities, right, we all live in like different neighborhoods. There were Black neighborhoods, there still are Latino neighborhoods, Asian American neighborhoods, but the problems in one community were very similar to the problems in the other communities. The idea was what we're doing here in this Black neighborhood actually works in the Latino neighborhood and in the Asian American neighborhood. And so they would work with activists in other communities to do the same kind of community building. And so among the key things actually that we still have that begins for the first time with the Black Panthers are free lunch programs. The Black Panthers begin the first free lunch program in the United States. Right? And because that was a big issue, right? That was a big issue of kids not having enough to eat, having to spend all day at school. And so they would provide in community centers that provide lunches for kids who didn't have enough to eat. That then gets, borrowed by other people, and we still live with it today. And we don't give credit to the fact that it's the Black Panthers that really begin that first community program focused on school lunches. That wasn't the only program, but that's one of the main ones that like we still live with today. They were heavily targeted by the CIA and by police in cities where they existed. And then in 1969, one of the most prominent Black Panther groups was in Chicago. And the leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago was Fred Hampton. He was 19 when he first started as an activist, he was really young, and then I believe he was 21 when he was killed. They were accusing him of some crime, and so police go into his apartment where he was there with other Black Panthers, and he was there with his pregnant wife, and the police just start shooting at everybody. At the time, the Chicago police claimed that they were acting in self-defense, that the Black Panthers in the apartment had started shooting them. The forensic evidence says otherwise. There was only one bullet hole in the whole apartment that did not come from a police weapon. And it probably came from the man who opened the door. So it was very clear then that a lot of these activists were being targeted by the American government. I have a YouTube, do I have time to play? I don't have time to play it. So maybe I'll play this next week because I think it's important enough to talk about. And what is key, one of the key elements here to me is the way in which we pick out bad guys in any kind of political landscape. Right? Oftentimes there's going to be many different people proposing different kinds of changes, proposing different solutions. And the media and the public likes to pick out, okay, these are the guys doing it correctly. These are the people who are doing it correctly. And these are the people who are not doing it correctly. We pick people to make the bad guys. And that ends up having consequences in terms of how we approach problems of race in this country. Right? We eliminate entire proposals just based on this is proposed by someone we consider to be the bad person. Right? And a lot of that was happening with the Black Panthers because they get so demonized that as like the big Black scary men that we're ignoring all the good that was done and also how small they were. They were not a huge threat to the US. They are put on the FBI's most wanted list as the most dangerous groups to the United States. But in reality, they were a threat ideologically more than anything else. And I think it's worth paying attention to them because a lot of the activism that we see today is really inspired and really comes out of these Black power, brown power, yellow power movements, right? When we talk about the kind of unionization and community building that is going to be done for farm workers, for example, in California, right? Farm workers and Cesar Chavez. A lot of that is made possible by these radical movements of the Black Panthers, of Malcolm X, these people that lay the groundwork and really give their lives for, right? Because they're most of them end up dead. So we lose that element of that leadership, but their messaging does survive. The message survives them. And I think that's what we see a lot. I see it a lot today in current movements. See a lot of inspiration, not from the nonviolent tactics, but more of the more radical, what was considered the more radical leaders and more radical solutions to racism. And I think part of it is, okay, we no longer have slavery. We no longer have segregation laws on the books. And yet racism hasn't gone away, right? It's still a problem. And so how can we change that? How can we actually make a difference? Clearly, there are things that haven't worked, right? And so what we need then is more radical solutions, since that's when people are pay attention and build on what the work of groups like the Black Power movement. So I'm like, I wish I had more time because I have a lot more to say on the Black Power movement and Malcolm X and all these people. Hopefully what this class is doing in part is giving you a taste of some of these themes so that then you can go take a class on Malcolm X, take a class on civil rights and really dig into it more because it's such a rich a rich time period, and the leadership of the time was so rich with ideas about what to do and how to tackle these problems. I'm going to stop the recording.